Some chains are meant to break us, while others are meant to set us free. The mist clung to Corvina hollow like a burial shroud, and Dr. Elena Vasquez should have heeded the warning signs, the crosses nailed backwards on every door, the way conversations died when strangers approached, the fact that no birds sang in these mountains. As a forensic anthropologist, she'd spent years studying death, but she'd never expected to become its subject. Now, with medieval iron shackles biting into her wrists in a stone basement that reeked of centuries-old fear, Elena realized her scholarly pursuit of ancient burial rituals had led her straight into one. Above her, the villagers chanted in a dialect that predated Latin, their voices rising with the blood moon's ascent. The ceremony had begun, and she was the offering. But when massive stone blocks exploded inward, and a figure stepped through the rubble, tall, aristocratic, with eyes that held the weight of endless centuries, Elena discovered that some rescues come with a price higher than death itself. Dmitri Corvina moved with predatory grace, and when he smiled, revealing fangs like polished ivory, Elena understood the terrible truth. She hadn't been chosen as a sacrifice to appease a monster. She'd been chosen to awaken one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the impossible figure before her, tall and elegant in the way of old portraits, dressed in midnight velvet that seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight. Dmitri Corvina's presence filled the cramped basement, making the stone walls feel suddenly insignificant. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice carrying the faint accent of nobility from centuries past. "Are you cold, or merely terrified?" Elena lifted her chin, calling upon the same composure that had carried her through crime scenes and mass graves. "I'm a scientist. I don't believe in monsters." His laugh was soft, almost fond. "How wonderfully stubborn. Even faced with evidence that contradicts your hypothesis, you cling to your rational worldview." He stepped closer, and she caught his scent. Not the decay she expected, but something like winter pine and old parchment. "Tell me, Dr. Vasquez, what brought you to my domain?" The question threw her. How did he know her name? "Research," she said carefully. "I came to study the preserved remains reportedly found in the monastery crypts. Medieval burial practices in this region are poorly documented." "Ah, yes. Your reputation precedes you." Dmitri moved with fluid grace around her bound form, his fingers trailing along the ancient stone walls. The forensic anthropologist who solved the Whitmore Cemetery mystery, who proved that the vampire burials in Connecticut were actually cholera victims, buried according to folk practices designed to prevent their return. His eyes gleamed with amusement. How ironic. Elena's blood chilled. She'd never published that research. It was still under peer review at the university. "How could you possibly—" "Know that?" He paused before her, close enough that she could see the inhuman stillness in his chest, the absence of breath. "I know many things, Elena. I know you've spent the last 3 years obsessively studying death rituals because you cannot accept what you witnessed in your childhood. Your grandmother's body rising from her deathbed to whisper goodbye. I know you've built your entire career on explaining away the supernatural because acknowledging its existence would shatter the careful walls you've built around your sanity." The words hit like physical blows. Elena's childhood trauma was something she'd never told anyone, not even her therapist. "You're lying. Your grandmother spoke to you in Romanian," Dmitri continued relentlessly, a language she'd never known in life. "She told you that some hungers transcend death, and you've spent every day since trying to prove her wrong." Elena's chains rattled as she jerked backward, her scientific mind reeling. Above them, the chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The blood moon's crimson light filtered through gaps in the stone, painting everything the color of old blood. "The villagers believe they're protecting themselves," Dmitri said, seeming to sense her growing panic. "Every few decades, when the blood moon rises, they offer someone to the monster in the castle. Someone educated, rational, someone who represents the modern world encroaching on their superstitions. His smile was predatory and sad in equal measure. They think they're feeding me. In truth, they're simply providing me with companions who might understand the weight of immortality. Companions? Elena's voice cracked. You mean victims? Do I? He reached out slowly, giving her time to flinch away, and touched her face with fingers cold as marble. The last was a doctor from Vienna, brilliant man, devoted to saving lives. He chose to join me rather than return to a world where death always wins in the end. Elena's scientific training warred with the evidence before her eyes. Everything she'd built her identity on, logic, reason, the natural order, crumbled like the basement wall he'd demolished. This is impossible. Vampires don't exist. You're suffering from a rare genetic condition, probably porphyria combined with Elena. Her name on his lips silenced her rambling analysis. Look at me. Really look. Against her will, she did. His skin held the translucent quality of finest porcelain. His dark hair fell in waves that caught no light, and his eyes, ancient beyond measure, holding depths of knowledge and sorrow that no human gaze could contain. I was born in 1067, he said quietly. I remember when this monastery was built, when the first villagers settled in the valley below. I've watched empires rise and fall, seen plagues sweep across continents, observed humanity's steady march toward rationality. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and now I've found someone who embodies that rationality so perfectly that breaking it might finally cure my loneliness. The chain suddenly felt heavier around Elena's wrists. You're insane. Perhaps 8 centuries of existence will do that to a creature. The chanting above reached a crescendo, then cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence, Elena could hear her own ragged breathing. The ceremony is complete. The villagers believe they've appeased me for another generation. We have until dawn to become acquainted before I must decide whether to let you return to your ordinary life, or offer you something extraordinary. His fangs gleamed in the crimson moonlight, and Elena realized her ordeal was just beginning. Elena's ordinary life. The phrase echoed in the sudden silence like a mockery. What ordinary life? The one where she spent 16-hour days hunched over bone fragments in the university's basement laboratory, mapping trauma patterns on medieval skulls. Where she ate cold coffee and stale pastries for dinner 3 nights out of 7 because she'd forgotten to leave the morgue. Where her only meaningful conversations were with graduate students who saw her as either a brilliant mentor or an obsessive recluse, depending on their charitable nature. You speak as if I have something to return to, she heard herself saying, then immediately regretted the admission. But Dimitri's impossible presence seemed to pull truth from her like a magnet drawing iron filings. His head tilted with predatory curiosity. Don't you? The question hung between them, and Elena found herself cataloguing what awaited her back in London. Her cramped flat in Bloomsbury, where she lived alone save for her collection of anatomical texts and forensic journals, the university position she'd fought tooth and nail to secure, the first woman in the anthropology department, constantly proving herself worthy of respect that came naturally to her male colleagues. Her research, always her research, chasing answers to questions that kept her awake at night. I have responsibilities, she said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. My students depend on me. The Whitmore research is groundbreaking. Your students fear you, Dimitri interrupted with casual certainty. They whisper that Dr. Vasquez sees ghosts in every grave, that she speaks to the dead with more warmth than the living. As for your colleagues, his smile was knowing and cruel. They tolerate your brilliance because it reflects well on the department, but they exclude you from their social circles. You eat lunch alone. You attend faculty gatherings out of obligation, not invitation. Each word landed with surgical precision, cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. How could he possibly know about the loneliness that gnawed at her, the way Professor Hartwell's wife had forgotten to invite her to the Christmas dinner, how her research partner Dr. Morrison published papers with barely a footnote acknowledging her contributions? You're guessing, she said weakly. I'm recognizing kinship. Dimitri's voice softened, becoming almost gentle. 8 centuries teaches one to identify fellow outcasts. You've built walls around yourself just as surely as I've isolated myself in this castle. The difference is, you tell yourself your solitude serves a noble purpose. The chains around her wrists suddenly felt less like restraints and more like anchors, not holding her captive, but preventing her from drifting into an abyss she'd spent years denying existed. Her grandmother's dying words surfaced unbidden. Some hungers transcend death. Draga mea. Elena had devoted her life to disproving that whispered prophecy. But what if the hunger wasn't supernatural? What if it was simply the human need for understanding, for someone who could see past the careful facade of respectability to the desperate loneliness beneath? I chose this life, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I chose scholarship over frivolous social connections. Did you choose it? Or did it choose you when you realized that the living could never accept what you'd witnessed? Dimitri moved closer, his presence both threatening and strangely comforting. When did you last feel truly understood, Elena? When did someone last look at you and see not the brilliant Dr. Vasquez, but the frightened child who watched her grandmother defy natural law? The question shattered something inside her chest, because the answer was never. Never in her 34 years had she felt truly seen, truly known. Her colleagues admired her mind, but found her intensity unsettling. Men courted her reputation but fled when faced with her passionate dedication to the dead. Even her family, what remained of them, loved her with the careful distance reserved for relatives whose choices they couldn't comprehend. You don't know me, she whispered, but the protest sounded pathetic even to her own ears. I know you've spent every night for the past month dreaming of this place before you ever heard of Corvina Hollow, Dimitri said, and her blood turned to ice water. I know you packed your grandmother's silver crucifix in your traveling case, then left it in your hotel room in Budapest because you couldn't bear to bring it to a place that might prove her right. I know you came here hoping to find evidence that would finally silence the voice in your head that whispers. Maybe, just maybe, death isn't the end of everything. Elena's breath caught. The dreams. How could he know about the dreams? Weeks of restless sleep filled with visions of crimson moonlight and ancient stones, calling to her across impossible distances. She dismissed them as stress, as her subconscious processing research anxiety. But now, what do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely audible above the settling silence from the ceremony above. Dimitri's smile was answer enough, and Elena realized that for the first time in her carefully ordered life, she might discover what it meant to be truly, terrifyingly alive. The crimson light filtering through the cracks above began to shift, deepening to a shade that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Elena felt the change before she understood it, a pressure in her chest, a tingling along her skin that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something fundamental reshaping itself around her. Moon reaches its apex, Dimitri murmured, his eyes reflecting the deepening red like polished garnets. Can you feel it, Elena? The way reality grows thin when celestial forces align. She wanted to deny it, to retreat into the comfortable fortress of scientific skepticism. But the rational explanations crumbled like ancient parchment as the air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made her teeth ache. Above them, she heard the villagers' footsteps retreating, their voices fading into the distance as they fled whatever they believed was about to occur. What's happening to me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Her skin felt hypersensitive, every nerve ending alive in a way that bordered on painful. She could smell things that shouldn't be possible, the mineral composition of the stone walls, the age of the iron in her shackles, the complex scent signature of the man before her that spoke of centuries and secrets. Dimitri's expression grew serious, almost reverent. The blood moon doesn't just call to creatures like me, Elena. It calls to those who stand at the threshold between worlds. The sensitive ones, the seekers, those whose souls hunger for truths that daylight obscures. He reached into his coat and withdrew an ornate silver key. Your grandmother felt it too, didn't she? The night she died, the pull toward something larger than the mundane world could contain. Elena's breath hitched. She remembered that night with crystal clarity, not just her grandmother's impossible resurrection, but the hours before. The way her babushka had stared at the full moon through the hospital window, whispering prayers in a language that predated Romanian, predated Latin, predated anything the nuns at Elena's Catholic school could have recognized. "She said the old blood was waking in me," Elena whispered, the memory surfacing like a deep-water creature finally breaching the surface. "She said it would call me home someday." The key turned in her shackles with a sound like breaking ice. The iron fell away from her wrists, leaving behind marks that would fade but somehow never completely disappear. Elena rubbed her freed hands together, feeling circulation return along with a terrible sense of possibility. "Your great-great-grandmother was Roxandra Vasquez," Dmitri said, and Elena's heart stopped. She served as keeper of the old ways in the village of Brasov before the Austrian occupation drove her family west. The bloodline carries memory, Elena, even when the conscious mind forgets. Elena stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. She'd spent years researching her family tree, hitting dead ends at every turn whenever she tried to trace her grandmother's origins. The official records showed nothing before 1845, as if her family had materialized from thin air when they arrived in London. That's impossible. I've researched. Records can be destroyed, documents can be lost, but blood remembers what paper forgets. Dmitri extended his hand to help her stand, and Elena stared at it as if it were a serpent. The Vasquez line has served as mediators between the living and the dead for 7 centuries. Healers, wise women, guardians of liminal spaces. Your rational mind has been fighting your true nature since childhood, Elena, but tonight the blood moon strips away those civilized pretenses. Elena struggled to her feet without his assistance, her legs shaky from the cramped position and the weight of revelation. The basement felt different now, not a prison but a chrysalis. She could feel something awakening in her chest, unfurling like wings she'd never known she possessed. "You're lying," she said. But the words carried no conviction. Too many pieces were falling into place, her uncanny ability to read trauma in bone fragments, the way she could sense the emotional resonance of crime scenes, her grandmother's dying insistence that Elena had inherited the site. "Test it," Dmitri challenged, gesturing toward the stone walls. "Touch the foundation stones. Tell me what you feel." Against every rational instinct, Elena found herself moving toward the ancient masonry. Her palm pressed against the cold stone, and suddenly she was drowning in sensation, centuries of pain and fear soaking into the very structure, but underneath it, something else, something protective. Wards carved into the stone itself, symbols that predated Christianity, designed not to imprison but to contain, to guard against something that had been growing stronger with each passing decade. The monastery was built on a convergence point, she heard herself saying, the knowledge flowing through her like inherited memory. A place where the veil between worlds grows thin. The villagers think they're appeasing you, but they're really— She stopped, the full implication hitting her. They're feeding something else, aren't they? Something that makes even vampires afraid. Dimitri's smile was grim with approval. Now you begin to understand why I needed someone with your particular heritage. The barriers are failing, Elena, and you must choose. Return to London and pretend tonight never happened, or embrace what you truly are and help me prevent something far worse than vampires from breaking free. The choice hung before her like a blade, sharp and irrevocable. The choice hung before her like a blade, sharp and irrevocable. Elena snatched her hand away from the stone as if it had burned her, but the visions continued to cascade through her mind, fragments of knowledge that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. She saw the monastery's construction, its builders carefully placing each stone according to patterns that had nothing to do with Christian architecture. She felt the weight of centuries pressing down, layer upon layer of desperate prayers and protective rituals, all designed to keep something vast and hungry at bay. "No," she whispered, backing away from both the wall and Dimitri's expectant gaze. "This isn't real. I'm hallucinating. Trauma response. oxygen deprivation from being underground, some kind of psychotic break triggered by extreme stress. "Elena!" His voice cut through her spiraling panic with surgical gentleness. "Don't say my name like that." She whirled to face him, her composure finally cracking completely. "Don't pretend you know me. Don't pretend this is anything other than elaborate madness. I am a scientist. I believe in evidence, in peer review and the scientific method. I don't believe in vampires or blood moons or inherited mystical sight." But even as the words poured out of her, she could feel the lie of them. The rational world she'd built her identity around was crumbling, revealing foundations she'd never suspected. Her grandmother's final words echoed in her memory. "The old blood remembers, Draga mea. When the time comes, you will choose between what you know and what you are." "I have a life," Elena continued desperately, as if saying it could make it true. "Students depending on me, research that could revolutionize forensic anthropology. The Whitmore grant alone represents 3 years of work. Work that no one will remember in 50 years, Dmitri said quietly. Papers that will gather dust in university libraries while you grow old and bitter, wondering why you always felt like an exile in your own existence." The words hit too close to home. Elena had nightmares about that exact future. Herself at 60, alone in her laboratory, surrounded by other people's bones, while her own life withered away unexamined. But the alternative he was offering, "What you're suggesting is impossible," she said, but her voice had lost its conviction. "I can't simply abandon everything I've worked for to chase fantasies about supernatural bloodlines and mystical convergence points. Can't you?" Dmitri moved closer, and she found herself trapped between the stone wall and his imposing presence. "What would you truly be abandoning, Elena? A career where you're tolerated but never truly accepted? Colleagues who see you as a useful oddity? A life so empty that you've convinced yourself devotion to the dead is the same thing as living?" Each question was a knife twist, exposing truths she'd spent years avoiding. When had she last felt joy in her work instead of merely grim satisfaction? When had she last looked forward to anything beyond the next discovery that might finally silence the questions that haunted her? "The world I'm offering you is dangerous," Dmitri continued, his honesty somehow more terrifying than any lie could have been. "The things I'm asking you to face, what lies beneath this monastery, what grows stronger with each passing year, they could destroy your sanity, your life. Everything you understand about reality itself." Elena's throat constricted. "Then why are you asking me to choose it?" His smile was infinitely sad. "Because the alternative is worse. Because whatever is stirring beneath these foundations will break free eventually, with or without our intervention. And because—" he hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his ancient features. "Because I have been alone for 8 centuries, Elena, and I recognize the same isolation in you. Perhaps we can face the darkness together instead of drowning in it separately." The crimson light was beginning to fade as the blood moon moved past its zenith. Elena could feel the strange energy that had awakened in her starting to ebb, like a tide pulling back from the shore. If she was going to choose, truly choose, it had to be now, before the rational world reasserted its hold on her perceptions. She thought of her empty flat in London, of the papers waiting on her desk, of the careful life she'd constructed like a fortress against exactly this kind of chaos. Then she thought of her grandmother's eyes in those final moments, ancient and knowing, filled with secrets that had died with her because Elena had been too frightened to ask the right questions. "If I stay," she said slowly, "if I help you with whatever is coming, what happens to me? What do I become?" Dmitri's gaze never wavered. "I don't know," he admitted. "The last keeper of your bloodline died 2 centuries ago. We would be writing new rules, discovering new possibilities." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "You might lose everything you think you are, but you might find everything you were meant to become." Elena closed her eyes, standing at the crossroads between the known and the impossible, while somewhere in the depths beneath them, something ancient stirred in its sleep. Elena opened her eyes, and in that moment, she felt something fundamental shift within her chest, like a door she'd kept locked for 34 years finally swinging open. The rational voice that had governed her entire adult life grew quiet, overwhelmed by something far older and infinitely more certain. "I can't go back," she said, and the words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Even if I wanted to, even if I tried to pretend tonight never happened, I would spend the rest of my life wondering, looking over my shoulder, waiting for dreams of crimson moonlight to drive me mad." Dmitri nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his ancient eyes. The awakened can never truly sleep again. Elena stepped away from the stone wall, her movements deliberate and decisive despite the tremor in her hands. The basement that had been her prison now felt like a threshold, the last room of her old life, the first chamber of whatever lay ahead. "Tell me what you need me to do." "Are you certain?" His question carried centuries of weight. "Once you cross this threshold, Elena, there will be no university to return to, no colleagues to impress, no safe laboratory where you can study death from a comfortable distance. You'll be walking into the heart of darkness itself." A laugh escaped her, sharp, slightly hysterical, but genuine. "Comfortable distance? Dmitri, I've been running toward death my entire career. Every grave I've excavated, every bone I've analyzed, every crime scene I've walked through. I've been trying to understand the one thing that terrified me most. Maybe it's time I stopped running and faced it directly." She thought of the Whitmore grant, of the papers she'd never publish, of the students who would wonder why their intimidating professor had simply vanished without explanation. The loss felt surprisingly distant, like mourning someone she'd only known in passing. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Before my parents forbade it, before they decided such tales were unhealthy for a modern child. She spoke of women in our family who could see beyond the veil, who stood guard at the borders between worlds. I spent my entire academic career trying to prove those stories were folklore, but you chose forensic anthropology, because it was the closest you could come to speaking with the dead while maintaining scientific credibility," Dmitri finished. "Yes." The admission felt like a confession, like finally exhaling after holding her breath for decades. "And now you're telling me those stories were true, that the hunger I've felt all my life, the need to understand what lies beyond, wasn't pathology but inheritance." Elena moved toward the basement stairs, each step feeling monumental. Above them, the monastery lay silent, the villagers having fled whatever they believed the blood moon would unleash. She could feel the change in the air as the crimson light faded, but the awakening within her continued to unfurl, stretching muscles she'd never known she possessed. "What lies beneath this place?" she asked, pausing at the foot of the stone steps. "What am I agreeing to face?" Dmitri's expression grew grave. "Something that preceded vampires, that preceded most of the supernatural creatures your grandmother's stories warned against. An entity that feeds on fear and despair, that grows stronger each time the villagers offer it tribute. The convergence point beneath the monastery has been its anchor for millennia, but the barriers our ancestors built are failing." Elena pressed her palm against the stair rail, feeling the thrum of power running through the ancient stone like a heartbeat. The sensation should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if she'd spent her entire life in foreign territory and was finally approaching familiar ground. "The villagers don't know what they're really feeding," she said, understanding blooming like dark flowers in her mind. "They think their sacrifices appease you, but they're actually strengthening something far worse. For 8 centuries, I've been the monster they fear instead of the protection they need," Dmitri confirmed. "Better they believe their local vampire lord demands tribute than realize they're nurturing something that could consume entire cities." Elena began climbing the stairs, her decision crystallizing with each upward step. Behind her, she left Dr. Elena Vasquez, the careful scholar, the rational scientist, the woman who'd built walls around her heart to keep the impossible at bay. Ahead lay something unnamed and terrifying and absolutely necessary. "I don't know what I'm becoming," she said, reaching the basement door and placing her hand on its weathered wood. but I know I can't keep running from what I am." She pushed open the door, stepping from the stone depths into the monastery's shadowed halls. The blood moon's light streamed through broken windows, painting everything in shades of prophecy and possibility. Elena Vasquez walked forward into her inheritance, leaving her old life buried in the basement behind her, like bones in an empty grave. There would be no going back. The monastery's corridor stretched before Elena like the ribcage of some massive, long-dead creature. Moonlight filtered through shattered stained glass, casting fractured rainbows across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of prayer and penance. But as she stepped fully into this space between worlds, Elena realized the building was far from empty. "You're not alone here," she whispered, her newfound sensitivity picking up traces of recent presence. Fear, sweat, and trembling hands, the metallic scent of spilled blood that was hours old but still warm to her enhanced perception. Dmitri emerged behind her, his movements silent as falling snow. The ceremony required witnesses. Some fled when the moon began to wane, but others— He tilted his head, listening to sounds beyond human hearing. Others remain. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of the first figure huddled in an alcove near the altar. An elderly woman in rough-spun wool, clutching a wooden crucifix with white-knuckled desperation. When the woman's eyes met Elena's, she gasped and began muttering rapid prayers in what sounded like archaic Romanian. "She recognizes something in you," Dmitri observed quietly. "The bloodline carries markers that those versed in the old ways can identify." More shapes emerged from the shadows. 3 men of varying ages, a middle-aged woman whose hands shook as she backed against a pillar, and standing separate from the others, a young woman of perhaps 20 who watched Elena with calculating rather than fearful eyes. "The sacrifice lives," the young woman said in accented English, her voice carrying an odd mixture of relief and concern. This was not supposed to happen. Elena found herself moving toward the speaker with confidence she didn't recognize as her own. "You're not from the village, Maria Popescu," the woman replied, inclining her head slightly. "I came from Brasov when the signs began manifesting. My grandmother trained under the last keeper of your family's line." Her gaze shifted meaningfully to Dmitri. "She told me to watch for the blood moon that would awaken the old contracts." The word contracts sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the monastery's stone walls. "What contracts?" "Agreements made when the barriers were first established," Maria continued. "Bindings that required renewal by blood and choice every few centuries. The villagers have been fumbling through bastardized versions of the renewal ritual, but without proper understanding. They've been strengthening the very thing they meant to contain," Elena finished, the knowledge surfacing from depths she couldn't name. "And the real ritual requires willing participation from someone of the Keeper bloodline." Maria's nod was grim with approval. "Your grandmother's grandmother was the last to perform it properly. Since then, the entity below has grown fat on misdirected offerings." One of the village men stepped forward, his weathered face creased with generations of fear. "The new Keeper," he said in broken English, then switched to rapid-fire Romanian that Elena found herself understanding despite never having learned the language properly. "The old blood has returned to us. The family of guardians. Will she be strong enough for what comes next?" Elena started at her own comprehension, but Maria was nodding as if this were perfectly natural. "The awakening doesn't just unlock sensitivity to supernatural forces," she explained. "It restores knowledge and abilities that were always yours by right." "What else will I remember?" Elena asked, though part of her feared the answer. "Everything the bloodline has learned about walking between worlds," Maria said. "Every technique for binding entities, every ward against darkness, every price that must be paid to keep the barriers strong." Her expression grew serious. "But also every failure, every keeper who was consumed by what she tried to control." The elderly woman with the crucifix suddenly stood, her prayers shifting from Latin to something far older. She approached Elena with shuffling steps, reaching out with one trembling finger to touch Elena's forehead. The contact sent images cascading through Elena's mind. Women who shared her features standing in circles of power, speaking words that made reality bend around them. "Roxandra's blood runs true," the old woman whispered in heavily accented English. "But can she pay the price?" "What price?" Elena demanded. But it was Dmitri who answered. "To properly renew the barriers, to reset the containment wards, requires a sacrifice of equal power to what's being bound," he said quietly. "Not death, necessarily, but transformation. The Keeper must anchor part of herself to the convergence point permanently. She becomes the living seal." Elena felt the weight of understanding settle on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. The choice wasn't simply between her old life and this new world. It was between remaining fully human and becoming something else entirely. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Maria's answer chilled her to the bone. The entity stirs even now. "By the next sunset, it will be too late for any choice at all." The monastery fell silent except for the whisper of wind through broken stone, as if the ancient walls themselves were holding their breath. Elena stood motionless, feeling the weight of 24 hours pressing against her consciousness like a physical force. Around her, the assembled villagers watched with the desperate hope of the drowning. People who had thrown their ritual offerings into darkness for generations without understanding they were feeding their own destruction. 24 hours, Elena repeated, her voice barely audible. The time frame felt both impossibly short and terrifyingly long. "What happens if I refuse? If I simply walk away?" Maria's expression grew haunted. "The entity will break free regardless. Without proper barriers, it will consume everything within 100 miles before moving on to larger prey. Brasov first, then Budapest, spreading outward like a plague of living darkness." Elena closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was being asked. When she'd packed her research bags in London, her greatest concern had been securing enough funding for a proper excavation. Now she was being told that millions of lives hung in the balance of her decision, a decision she was uniquely qualified to make because of blood she'd never known ran in her veins. "I need to understand what I'm choosing between," she said, opening her eyes to meet Dmitri's ancient gaze. "Show me what lies beneath, Elena," Dmitri began, his tone cautioning. "No." Her voice carried new authority, drawn from sources she was only beginning to recognize. "If I'm to become the living seal, if I'm to anchor part of myself to that thing for the rest of whatever existence awaits me, I need to see it. I need to understand exactly what kind of monster I'll be chained to." The elderly woman made the sign of the cross and muttered something that sounded like a prayer for the dead. One of the village men backed toward the monastery doors, his nerve finally breaking. "The convergence point isn't meant for human eyes," Maria warned. "Even Keeper bloodlines have limits. What you're asking could drive you mad before you have the chance to complete the ritual." Elena thought of her comfortable laboratory, of bones that told their stories safely after centuries of silence. She'd built her career on examining death from a scholarly distance, treating horror as academic puzzle. But standing in this cursed monastery with supernatural power awakening in her bloodstream, she understood that distance had always been illusion. Death had been courting her since birth, waiting for her to stop running and embrace her true inheritance. "Madness might be preferable to ignorance," she said. "How do we reach it?" Dmitri studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for cracks in her resolve. Finally, he nodded toward a narrow archway Elena hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to exist in her peripheral vision, but shifted when she looked directly at it. "The path down exists between moments," he explained. "It requires someone of Keeper blood to open it, and vampire strength to survive what guards the way." His expression grew darker. "But once we descend, Elena, there may be no returning unchanged. The entity's proximity alone will begin the transformation process." Elena felt something cold unfurl in her chest. Not fear, but a terrible clarity that made her previous life seem like sleepwalking. Then we shouldn't waste time debating. She started toward the shifting archway, each step feeling like walking deeper into a half-remembered dream. Behind her, she could hear the villagers whispering in languages that predated Latin, offering blessings or warnings she couldn't distinguish. Maria's footsteps followed, along with Dimitri's silent presence. "There's something you should know," Dimitri said quietly as they approached the threshold, "about why the ritual specifically requires willing participation from your bloodline." Elena paused, her hand inches from the archway's edge. The stone felt warm despite the monastery's chill, pulsing with rhythms that matched her heartbeat. "Tell me." "The first keeper who bound this entity, she didn't survive the process. The binding consumed her entirely, leaving only enough consciousness to maintain the barriers. Every keeper since has been trying to find a way to complete the ritual without suffering the same fate." His voice carried centuries of guilt. "I should have prevented your grandmother from attempting it. Should have found another way before the bloodline ended with her death." Elena's throat tightened as pieces clicked into place. "My grandmother didn't die of old age. She tried to renew the barriers alone, without proper preparation or support. The entity was weaker then. The attempt might have succeeded if—" Dimitri's words cut off abruptly. "I failed her. I will not fail you." The archway pulsed brighter, responding to Elena's proximity. Through its wavering surface, she glimpsed stairs descending into darkness that had weight and texture, as if shadows could be woven into solid matter. At the bottom of those stairs waited the truth she'd spent her life avoiding, the final answer to questions she'd been asking since childhood. Elena stepped through the archway, feeling reality bend around her like heated glass, and began her descent toward the convergence point where something ancient and hungry stirred in its failing prison, counting down the hours until sunset. The stairs beneath Elena's feet were carved from stone that predated human civilization, each step worn smooth by the passage of beings she couldn't name. The darkness ahead wasn't merely the absence of light, it was a living thing that pressed against her consciousness, testing the boundaries of her newly awakened senses. With each downward step, the weight of the entity's presence grew heavier, until breathing required conscious effort. Behind her, Dimitri moved with supernatural grace, but even his centuries of experience couldn't mask the tension radiating from his form. Maria's footsteps faltered twice, forcing her to pause and steady herself against the stone walls that thrummed with malevolent energy. "How much farther?" Elena asked, though her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere before the words could carry. "Distance isn't measured in feet here," Dimitri replied quietly. "We descend until we reach the place where reality grows thin." As if summoned by his words, the stairs ended abruptly at a circular chamber carved from living rock. Elena stepped onto the floor and immediately stumbled, her legs suddenly weak as the full force of the entity's presence crashed over her. The air itself felt thick as syrup, laden with whispers in languages that hurt to hear. Along the chamber walls, symbols pulsed with sickly phosphorescent light, not carved but somehow burned into the stone by exposure to whatever dwelt at the center. And at the center, contained within a complex pattern of intersecting circles that flickered like failing electrical circuits, crouched something that Elena's mind refused to process completely. Her enhanced perception caught fragments, scales that reflected no light, appendages that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, eyes that weren't eyes but windows into void. The entity was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien, a creature from the spaces between stars that had been trapped in earthly stone for millennia. "God in heaven," Maria breathed, making the sign of the cross with shaking hands. The binding circles flared brighter at the sound of prayer, but Elena could see the gaps now, places where the containment had worn thin, where tendrils of influence leaked through to poison the surrounding earth. The villagers' misguided sacrifices had fed those gaps, weakening the very barriers they'd meant to strengthen. "Who disturbs my slumber?" The voice didn't come through her ears, but directly into her mind, carrying with it images of cities consumed, of populations drained not just of life, but of hope itself. Elena felt her sanity strain against the contact, her scientific rationality crumbling like paper in a fire. "Ah," the entity continued, its attention focusing on her with predatory intensity. The blood returns. How long I have waited for you, little keeper. How long I have grown hungry in this prison of stone and starlight. Elena forced herself to step closer, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. You know what I am. I know what you will become, came the reply, accompanied by visions that made her knees buckle. She saw herself bound to this place, her consciousness stretched between human form and something far more terrible, serving as the living anchor that kept the entity trapped, while slowly being consumed by proximity to its alien nature. The previous keepers, Elena gasped, understanding flooding through her. They're still here. She could sense them now. Layers of consciousness woven into the binding circles, women of her bloodline who had sacrificed their humanity to maintain the prison. Their whispered warnings reached her across centuries. Run. Save yourself. The price is too high. But other voices called to her as well, carrying different counsel. Stand firm. Complete what we began. The world depends on your choice. Dimitri's hand found her shoulder, steadying her against the psychic assault. You don't have to decide now, he said urgently. We can return. Find another way. There is no other way, the entity interrupted, its amusement dark as poisoned honey. The little lamb knows this. She has always known this. Why else would she have spent her life studying death, if not to prepare for this moment of choosing? The terrible truth of its words hit Elena like physical blows. Every archaeological dig, every forensic examination, every careful analysis of ancient burial practices, all of it had been leading here, to this chamber where she would either complete her family's legacy or watch the world burn. The entity's presence pressed closer, testing the weakening barriers. Choose quickly, Keeper. The sun sets in 18 hours and my patience grows thin. Will you take your place among the guardians, or shall I finally taste freedom after all these empty centuries? Elena felt something fundamental tear inside her chest, not physical pain, but the death of who she had been. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the rational scientist, was crumbling away, leaving behind something raw and powerful and terrifyingly uncertain. I need to know, she whispered, her voice barely human. If I become the seal, how long will I remain myself? The entity's laughter was the sound of dying stars. Long enough to regret your choice, little keeper. Long enough to understand what love costs in a world built on necessary sacrifices. Above them, distant thunder announced the approaching storm. The thunder grew closer, each rumble seeming to shake the binding circles until their light flickered like candles in a hurricane. Elena watched in growing horror as hairline cracks appeared in the containment patterns, spreading outward from where the entity's presence pressed against its prison. The storm feeds me, the creature whispered into her mind, its voice now carrying undertones of triumph. Each lightning strike weakens what holds me. Your ancestors built well, but even their power cannot withstand the fury of heaven turned against itself. What does it mean? Elena demanded, but even as she spoke, understanding crashed over her with sickening clarity. The approaching tempest wasn't natural. It was the entity's influence finally growing strong enough to affect weather patterns, drawing electrical fury from the sky to batter its prison from above, while it pushed outward from within. Maria stumbled backward, her face pale as parchment. The convergence is accelerating. What should take 18 hours? She broke off as one of the binding circles guttered and went dark entirely. We have minutes, not hours. Elena felt the entity's glee like acid in her veins as another circle failed. Through the widening gaps, she caught glimpses of what lay beyond the binding, not just the creature itself, but the realm it came from, a dimension where hunger was the only truth and consumption the only purpose. If it broke free now, before she could complete the ritual, there would be no containing it again. Too late, little keeper, the entity crooned. Your bloodline's arrogance has finally been punished. Did you think you could study death from a distance forever? Did you believe knowledge without commitment could save you? Dimitri moved to Elena's side, his ancient features etched with desperate determination. There might be another way. If I can channel enough power through the vampire bond, perhaps we can reinforce the circles temporarily. His words cut off in a strangled cry as the entity's attention fixed on him with malicious interest. The blood drinker offers himself? How touching, how utterly useless. The creature's laughter sent visible ripples through the air. Your kind are parasites, feeding on life but creating nothing. You have no power here except what you steal from others. Elena watched in mounting panic as the third circle began to dim, its light pulsing erratically. The voices of her ancestors grew more frantic in her mind, their warnings dissolving into wordless screams as the binding that held their consciousness began to unravel. She was losing them, losing the accumulated wisdom of generations, and once they were gone, she would face this choice completely alone. "There has to be something we can do," she said, but her voice carried no conviction. The entity was right. She had spent her life studying death without truly understanding it, examining the remnants of ancient power without ever grasping its cost. Now that knowledge stood useless before the reality of forces that predated human civilization. "Accept the inevitable," the entity whispered, its presence expanding as another crack split the remaining bindings. "Your grandmother understood, in the end. She came to me willingly when she realized the price of resistance." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. "My grandmother didn't try to renew the barriers. She tried to join you." "Such a bright child," came the mocking reply. "Yes, she offered herself as sustenance rather than watch the world burn. But one old woman's life force was barely an appetizer. I remain hungry, little keeper. So very, very hungry." Elena felt her last hope crumble as the truth settled over her. Her grandmother hadn't died attempting heroic sacrifice. She had chosen damnation over watching millions perish, feeding herself to the entity in hopes of buying the world a few more years. And even that desperate gambit had failed. The fourth circle collapsed entirely, sending shockwaves through the chamber that brought dust cascading from the ceiling. Through the widening breach, Elena could see the entity beginning to unfold, appendages that existed in dimensions. Her eyes couldn't properly track reaching toward freedom. Soon it would be too large for the remaining bindings to contain. Maria grabbed Elena's arm, her grip painful in its intensity. "We have to run. Get to the surface, warn the authorities, evacuate as many as possible before..." "Before what?" Elena laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. "Before we tell them a creature from beyond the stars is about to devour half of Europe. Before we explain that the only hope of stopping it died with my grandmother's failure." "The child begins to understand," the entity purred. "Understanding breeds despair, and despair breeds the clarity to accept what cannot be changed. Soon you will stop fighting the inevitable." The fifth circle flickered and went dark. Above them, lightning struck the monastery with such force that chunks of stone rained down into the chamber. Elena looked up through the settling dust and saw the first tendrils of darkness seeping through the ceiling. The entity's influence finally strong enough to manifest physically beyond its prison. In 18 hours, she had lost everything: her scientific worldview, her family's legacy, her hope of saving anyone. The monster was winning, and all she could do was watch the world prepare to burn.